There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that doesn't show on the outside. Life continues, responsibilities are met, conversations happen, and yet something inside feels displaced, as if the center that once gave meaning to everything has slowly faded into the background. It's not a dramatic collapse, not a visible crisis, but a subtle drifting. A sense that decisions are being made without clarity, that movement exists without direction, and that even moments of rest fail to restore what feels missing. Many interpret this state as being lost, as if they have somehow stepped off their path and can no longer find their way back. But what if the problem is not that you are lost, but that you have become disconnected? Being lost suggests absence, a lack of direction that cannot be accessed. Disconnection, on the other hand, implies that something still exists, but the signal has been interrupted. The path is not gone. The internal compass is not broken. It is simply surrounded by interference. This distinction changes everything, because what can be disconnected can also be restored. Over time, the human system adapts to survive. The mind becomes louder, the body holds tension, emotions are suppressed or repeated, and perception narrows. In this state, clarity doesn't disappear because life has stopped communicating, but because the internal environment is no longer able to interpret what is being received. According to ideas often explored by Joe Dispenza, when the body becomes conditioned by the past, it begins to operate as a memory bank, repeating emotional patterns that block access to new possibilities. A person may consciously desire change, but unconsciously remain anchored in what is familiar. Bruce Lipton's perspective complements this by suggesting that repeated thoughts and emotional states shape how reality is perceived and experienced. It's not simply about what is happening externally, but about how the internal filter has been trained to interpret it. When that filter is saturated with noise, urgency, and unresolved emotional residue, even clear signals can feel distant or non-existent. Imagine for a moment that you are not a broken compass, but a compass placed in the middle of a magnetic storm. The needle doesn't stop working, it simply cannot stabilize long enough to point in a clear direction. The frustration is not caused by the absence of guidance, but by the inability to read it. This is where the real conversation begins. Not with promises of instant transformation or mystical shortcuts, but with a deeper understanding of what has been interfering with your ability to feel direction at all. Because perhaps the universe has not gone silent. Perhaps what has been buried is the capacity to listen. Disconnection rarely announces itself with a dramatic rupture. It does not arrive as a single moment where everything clearly breaks apart. Instead, it unfolds quietly, almost imperceptibly, through a series of small internal withdrawals. A moment where presence is replaced by urgency. A decision where inner truth is set aside in favor of immediate comfort or external validation. A day where silence feels uncomfortable, so distraction becomes the default. Over time, these subtle shifts accumulate, and what was once a natural sense of alignment begins to feel distant. At an emotional level, disconnection often appears as a kind of weight that cannot be easily explained. There is fatigue that persists even after rest, a background tension that never fully dissolves, and a quiet dissatisfaction that lingers beneath everyday experiences. Mentally, it can take the form of constant overthinking, where every choice feels uncertain, and every possibility seems equally unclear. The person begins to question their own perception, losing trust in their ability to interpret what they feel and what they sense. This loss of trust is one of the most significant consequences of disconnection. When the internal signal becomes inconsistent, the tendency is to search for certainty outside. Decisions become dependent on opinions, circumstances, or signs that are expected to come from the external world. Yet the more this external reliance grows, the weaker the internal reference becomes. It is not that guidance has disappeared, but that it is no longer recognized as valid. There is also a deeper layer that operates beyond thoughts and emotions, something that could be described as energetic coherence. When what a person consciously desires does not match what they repeatedly feel and embody, an internal contradiction forms. This contradiction is not abstract. It is lived daily. Someone may seek peace while remaining in a constant state of urgency, or desire clarity while feeding cycles of doubt and anticipation. The system cannot stabilize under these conditions because it is being pulled in opposing directions. In this state, the ability to perceive direction weakens. not because life has stopped offering signals, but because the internal environment has become too turbulent to interpret them. Trying to access clarity while the nervous system is overstimulated is like trying to see the bottom of a lake while the water is being constantly disturbed. The more movement there is on the surface, the less visible what lies beneath becomes. What complicates this even further is that many people attempt to reconnect without addressing this turbulence. They search for meaning, purpose, or alignment while still operating from a physiological state of alertness and protection. The body remains conditioned to anticipate threats, the mind continues to rehearse uncertainty, and emotions recycle familiar patterns. Under these conditions, even moments of insight struggle to take root because the system quickly returns to what it recognizes as familiar. Disconnection, then, is not simply a philosophical idea. It is a lived condition that affects perception, decision-making, and the very way reality is experienced. It is the result of repeated internal incoherence, sustained over time, until the original sense of direction becomes obscured. The person does not stop receiving signals, they stop being able to interpret them with clarity. This is why the search for direction often feels frustrating. The effort is placed on finding answers, while the real interruption lies in the capacity to perceive them. Before any form of reconnection can occur, something more fundamental needs to be understood. Not how to move forward immediately, but what has been interfering with the ability to feel aligned in the first place. If disconnection begins quietly, it is sustained even more silently. Beneath the visible layer of indecision and fatigue, there are patterns operating with remarkable consistency, shaping perception and reinforcing the same internal state, day after day. These patterns are rarely obvious. They do not present themselves as clear obstacles, but as familiar ways of thinking, reacting, and anticipating. Over time, they become so normalized that they are no longer questioned, only lived. One of the most subtle of these patterns is the tension between what is consciously desired and what is emotionally rehearsed. A person may speak about peace, clarity, and purpose, yet internally remain anchored in urgency, doubt, and the need to control outcomes. This dissonance is not merely conceptual. It creates a constant friction within the system, where intention moves in one direction and emotional conditioning pulls in another. The result is not stagnation, but a kind of circular movement that feels like effort without progress. The mind plays a central role in maintaining this loop. It is designed to prioritize familiarity, not truth. What is known, even if it is uncomfortable, is perceived as safer than what is unknown. This is why old patterns persist long after they are recognized. The brain does not evaluate them based on their usefulness, but on their predictability. In this way, discomfort can become a form of stability, while genuine change is perceived as a disruption. This mechanism explains why many attempts at reconnection feel inconsistent. Moments of insight arise, sometimes with clarity and depth, yet they are quickly followed by a return to previous states. It is not a lack of understanding that interrupts the process, but a deeper loyalty to what has been repeatedly experienced. The system does not shift simply because a new idea is introduced. It shifts when a new state is sustained long enough to become familiar. There is also a tendency to approach reconnection as a form of escape. The idea of aligning with something greater is often used as a way to move away from discomfort, rather than to engage with it more honestly. In this context, spirituality becomes performative. Symbols, language, and practices are adopted, but they remain at the surface, serving more as a temporary relief than as a genuine transformation. The internal structure remains unchanged, and the sense of disconnection persists beneath the appearance of progress. At the same time, modern conditions intensify this dynamic. Constant stimulation, rapid information, and continuous engagement with external inputs reduce the space available for internal perception. The system becomes accustomed to high levels of dopamine, where silence feels unfamiliar and stillness becomes difficult to sustain. In such an environment, subtle signals are easily overlooked, not because they are absent, but because they are too quiet to compete with the noise. This creates a paradox. The search for connection intensifies, while the conditions necessary to perceive it are continuously weakened. The more the person seeks answers externally, the less accessible the internal reference becomes. And yet the assumption often remains that something is missing, rather than recognizing that something is being overshadowed. There is a deeper layer to this as well, one that is rarely acknowledged. The greatest barrier is not the absence of belief, but the unconscious attachment to the current way of being. Even when discomfort is recognized, it carries a certain familiarity that feels stable. Letting go of it is not simply a cognitive decision. It involves entering a space where identity itself begins to shift, and that transition can feel uncertain. In this sense, disconnection is not maintained by a single cause, but by a network of reinforcing patterns. Each one contributes to the same outcome, narrowing perception and weakening the sense of direction. Recognizing these patterns does not immediately dissolve them, but it changes the relationship with them. What was automatic becomes visible, and what is visible begins to lose its unquestioned authority. There is a moment, often subtle, where the search for direction begins to shift, not because answers suddenly appear in a grand or undeniable form, but because something internal starts to reorganize. The expectation that clarity must arrive as a dramatic revelation begins to soften, and in its place, a quieter form of perception emerges. It is less about receiving something new, and more about removing what has been distorting what was already present. One of the most misunderstood aspects of reconnection is the belief that it should feel elevated, intense, or extraordinary. There is an assumption that alignment will arrive as a surge of certainty, a powerful emotional state that confirms everything at once. But genuine reconnection rarely announces itself this way. More often it begins as a reduction, a slight decrease in internal noise, a moment where the mind is less crowded, a subtle sense that something feels clearer, even if it cannot yet be fully explained. This shift is not accidental. It reflects a movement toward coherence, where thought, emotion, and attention begin to align instead of pulling in different directions. When this alignment starts to form, the system no longer needs to generate as much internal resistance. Energy that was previously used to maintain conflicting states becomes available for perception. In this condition, direction does not need to be forced. It begins to reveal itself in ways that are simple, almost understated. Clarity, in this sense, is not the presence of all answers, but the absence of excessive interference. It may appear as a feeling of relief without a clear reason, or as a decision that suddenly feels lighter, without the usual tension attached to it. Sometimes it is recognized in what is no longer compelling. Paths that once seemed urgent lose their intensity, not because they are inherently wrong, but because they are no longer aligned with the internal state that is emerging. This is why the process of reconnection often feels counterintuitive. The impulse is to seek more information, more signals, more confirmation. Yet what allows perception to deepen is not the accumulation of inputs, but the refinement of attention. When the system becomes less reactive, it becomes more receptive. And in that receptivity, subtle forms of guidance become visible. There is also a shift in how the idea of the universe is experienced. Instead of being perceived as something external that delivers answers, it begins to feel more like a field of interaction, where meaning is not imposed from outside but arises through alignment. The distinction between internal and external becomes less rigid. What is felt within begins to resonate with what is observed, and the sense of separation gradually diminishes. In this state, imagination takes on a different role. It is no longer used as an escape from reality, but as a way of shaping internal orientation. The images, thoughts, and narratives that are repeatedly sustained begin to influence how situations are interpreted and how possibilities are perceived. This does not operate as a form of illusion, but as a restructuring of attention. What is consistently held in awareness begins to guide what is noticed and what is acted upon. The rhythm of this process resembles something found in nature. When water is disturbed, it becomes opaque, its contents hidden by constant movement. It does not become clear through force but through stillness. As movement subsides, clarity emerges on its own. The same principle applies here. The system does not need to be pushed into alignment. It becomes aligned as the excess agitation gradually settles. Reconnection, then, is not a sudden transformation, but a gradual return to coherence. It changes the way perception functions before it changes external circumstances. The person begins to see differently, to feel differently, and from that shift, decisions begin to carry a different quality. Direction is no longer something to be chased, but something that becomes visible when the internal environment allows it to appear. As the internal environment begins to reorganize, the question naturally shifts from understanding to integration, not in the sense of adopting rigid routines or external formulas, but in allowing the subtle coherence that has emerged to become part of everyday experience. Because without this integration, even the most meaningful insights remain temporary, unable to stabilize within the rhythm of real life. What becomes evident at this stage is that reconnection is not sustained by intensity, but by consistency. It is not the peak moments of clarity that define the process, but the quiet continuity of small, aligned states. The way attention is directed throughout the day, the tone of internal dialogue, the relationship with silence and the sensitivity to one's own emotional patterns all begin to shape the quality of perception. These elements, often overlooked, form the foundation upon which direction becomes accessible. There is also a renewed awareness of the body's role in this process. Understanding something intellectually does not immediately translate into a different experience. The body, conditioned over time to operate within certain emotional patterns, continues to respond based on what it recognizes as familiar. If it has been trained to remain in alertness, anticipation, or defense, it will not simply shift because a new perspective has been introduced. It requires a gradual reconditioning, where new states are not only perceived, but felt repeatedly until they become natural. This is where subtle observation becomes significant, not as a technique to control or fix, but as a way of recognizing when disconnection begins to reappear. There are moments, often unnoticed, where a person moves away from their own internal reference. It may happen in the form of seeking approval, anticipating outcomes, or suppressing what is genuinely felt in favor of what seems more acceptable. These moments do not appear dramatic, yet they carry the same pattern that originally created the sense of disconnection. At the same time, the distinction between different internal signals becomes clearer. What once felt confusing begins to separate into recognizable textures. There is a difference between anxiety and intuition, even though both can produce a sense of urgency. Anxiety tends to be repetitive, insistent, and future-oriented, often accompanied by tension. Intuition, in contrast, is quieter, more direct, and does not require constant reinforcement. It does not argue for its validity. It simply presents itself, often in a way that feels simple and precise. As this sensitivity develops, coherence can be observed more directly. There is a natural alignment between what is desired and what is sustained internally. The question shifts from what is being asked for to whether the internal state reflects that request, not as a judgment, but as a form of clarity. When there is alignment, actions begin to feel less forced. Decisions carry less friction. Even uncertainty becomes more tolerable because it is no longer accompanied by the same level of internal conflict. Reconnection also begins to extend beyond the internal landscape into the way life is structured. Boundaries, environments, and rhythms start to reflect a different level of awareness. What was previously accepted without question may no longer feel compatible, not out of rejection, but out of recognition. The person begins to sense when something disrupts coherence, and this awareness gradually influences the choices that are made. The signs of this realignment are often subtle. There is less urgency to resolve everything at once. A greater sense of discernment emerges, where not every impulse requires action. Situations that once felt overwhelming become more navigable, not because they have changed, but because the internal response has shifted. There may even be moments that feel like coincidences, small alignments that seem to confirm a certain direction, though they are experienced more as a natural unfolding than as something extraordinary. In this state, life does not become free of complexity or challenge. What changes is the way those challenges are experienced. Instead of feeling like a continuous struggle without orientation, there is a sense that movement is possible, even without complete certainty. The path is not fully revealed, but it is no longer obscured by constant interference. This is where the process settles into something more stable, not as a final destination, but as a relationship that continues to evolve. Direction is no longer something distant to be discovered, but something that becomes accessible through the quality of presence that is sustained. What appeared at first as a lack of direction begins to reveal itself as something else entirely. Not an absence of path, but an excess of interference between you and the quiet intelligence that has always existed within you. The confusion, the doubt, the sense of drifting without clarity were never proof that life had stopped guiding you. They were signs that the internal space required to perceive that guidance had become saturated. Throughout this journey, a different perspective has taken shape. Disconnection is not failure. It is a state, and like any state, it can shift when the patterns that sustain it are seen, understood, and gradually softened. What once felt like being lost transforms into something more precise, a temporary misalignment between what is lived internally and what is sought externally. The ideas often explored by thinkers like Napoleon Hill echo here in a grounded way. What occupies the mind consistently begins to shape direction, not through mystical force, but through repetition and internal focus. In the same way, Neville Goddard's reflections suggest that imagination, when sustained with feeling, is not an escape, but a rehearsal of a different way of being. These are not promises of instant change, but reminders that the inner world is not passive, it is formative. To feel direction again is not to possess all answers. It is to regain a level of trust that allows movement without constant self-abandonment. It is to walk without needing certainty at every step, because something deeper has become reliable again. Perhaps nothing essential was ever lost. Perhaps what was missing was the space to hear it. Now consider this. Now, if the direction you are searching for has never truly disappeared, what would change if you stopped trying to find it outside and started recognizing where you have been ignoring it within? And if this perspective resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and remain with this experience. Continue watching the next video on your screen, where this exploration deepens and new layers of clarity begin to unfold.